So thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm happy to hopefully tell you something you don't already know about monkeys. My title is, Can We Identify a Primate Signature in Social Learning? And I'm actually going to carry on with some themes that earlier speakers talked about, although I didn't know when I prepared this that they were going to be saying what they said, but to me it's a nice continuation. And following on with the format showing conformity with the style of other speakers, I moved my thanks slide from the back to the front, also because I usually am in such a hurry at the end that this gets downplayed. But in any case, I'm going to tell you a lot about the work conducted at a field site in Brazil, and I'm thanking all these various people who helped us conduct the work, allowed us to work on their private land, and helped me with data processing. And my Ethocebus project colleagues, my co-directors with me, Patricia Itzar and Elisabetta Wieselbergi, without whom none of this would get done at all, and our various funding organizations. So my starting point is 3 questions posed by the organizers. I hope they remember that they posed these questions. First is, what features of social learning? They actually posed several more. I'm just taking a subset that I could deal with. What features of social learning are shared between humans and other species? And with what implications for the ancestral foundations of our own cultural nature? How does the nature of cognitive and other developmental phenomena in different species shape cultural outcomes? And finally, in what ways, with a few other additions, has human culture extended beyond that seen in other species? Well, humans are primates, and so we should, in principle, look first among other primates and then wider to other mammals, and then beyond that to the rest of the animal kingdom. So if we're going to find a primate signature, we're going to have a primate signature among mammals in particular, and then perhaps across other species. We already know what the cetacean signature is. It's vocal and also foraging specializations in a way that we don't see in primates. But I'm wondering if there is anything like that that we can identify in primates. And I was inspired in part by this paper by Miriam Heidel and a group of people that came out of a probably 2 or 3 day conference, trying to create a population level conception of the continuation of social, using social information all the way to culture. And what I liked about their model is that it acknowledges at the very beginning down here, you can probably not quite read it, I'm not sure from here, it looks rather blurry. It says social information, social learning, traditions, basic, and then bigger bars, modular, composite, complementary, notional, and these are considered to be uniquely human, and these others to be shared across other species. And they designate that in part by calling this ethological data and this archaeological, but of course you can also look at these things in contemporary humans. It doesn't have to be strictly archaeological. And they've bounded this in an XY coordinate system, time going this way and something they call evolutionary biological going this way. To be quite honest, I didn't quite understand that part of their model, but this part I understand. Their model distinguishes capacity, which they think about across the whole species, many populations, from performance, where each population is considered to have its own performance. And they discuss the performance in terms of something that she calls the problem solution distance, which is more or less how many separate components there are to manage in a given problem. So for example, in processing a fruit by directly banging it, there would be 0 distance between the action and the outcome of opening the fruit. Using a hammer to break that same fruit item would have a problem solution distance of 1. Using a hammer to chip a flake to cut something would have a problem solution distance of 2, and so forth. So we see at the basic level a problem solution distance of 0 or 1, and then on up here at least 1 or 2 and more. Following the long tradition in the field of archaeology, there is an emphasis in these diagrams on technology, on tools. Human cultures are bound up with technology, and that's true to a much lesser extent, or if at all, for non-human traditions or cultures, depending on what you want to call them. So cultures, human cultures, are founded on technology. Technology is founded on embodied skills that involve achieving goals using objects, okay? So one could ask, how general is that? This diagram I've copied from Hoppett and Laland's book on social learning, and it appears on page 99. And I have to check, actually, I have the right year on that, if it's 2013 or 2014. But in any case, the book on social learning that came out quite recently. And this is a decision tree that allows one to consider for any given kind of behavioral convergence between an observer and others, the mechanisms that might have been involved in arriving at that convergence. And you probably have heard, not so much in this conference, but if you read the animal social learning literature, there are lots of terms to describe these mechanisms. They are sometimes difficult to distinguish from one another, and definitely in practice they are difficult to distinguish in the behavior of the individuals that we see. So I'm showing you this because I'm not going to talk about this kind of approach to identifying specific mechanisms of individual learning. Most of these endpoints, as far as I can tell, are apparent across diverse taxa. So this taxonomy of learning mechanisms doesn't map onto a taxonomy of learning processes across taxa, as far as I can tell. It would be an interesting challenge for an ambitious student to try to map this decision tree onto the existing literature, but my guess is that you would find taxonomic representatives at every one of these bottom endpoints. I'm not going to pursue that. And we've also seen that there are other approaches. For example, Brandon was just talking about models involving basically economic models of decision making, considering risk and uncertainty and prior knowledge, and also modulation of social learning by social affiliation, by kin group, by alpha or social status. So there are many other dimensions that one could look at. So if these general features of social information and learning are shared among humans and other species, then the upper four levels of Heidel's model, that multicolored model, arise from other features than specific learning mechanisms, which are very general, and susceptibility to different kinds of social modulation, which is also quite general, or susceptibility or to be affected by uncertainty and risk and economic parameters. That also seems to be very general. These things are taxonomically very general. So that's not going to provide us with any kind of primate signature. So we have to look somewhere else. So this brings me to the organizer's second formative question, thinking about extending cultural capacity. And here I took some inspiration from the linguistics community, that small biases can have a big impact on the trajectory of learning. And I'm thinking particularly about a paper by Thompson et al. That appeared recently in PNAS. And I'm just going to read this. Evolutionary reasoning shows how we can have cognitively driven behavioral universals, and they're talking about in language, and yet extreme plasticity at the level of the individual, if and only if we account for the human capacity to transmit knowledge culturally. Wherever culture is involved, weak cognitive biases, and that's my emphasis on that phrase, rather than strong innate constraints should be the default assumption. Of course, they're arguing against a nativist approach to the acquisition of language there. But it's the idea that small biases can have a big impact on the trajectory of learning that I want to take from that quote. So if I'm looking for candidates for a primate signature in social learning, I'm looking for weak biases that can shape socially biased learning that might have a big impact on the trajectory, although they themselves are relatively small biases. So every person here can list a different set of biases that are of interest to them. And I've just started with some that seem very obvious to me. And there are two that I want to talk about. And one, I think that everybody who knows me in the audience is probably not surprised to hear, that I'm impressed with the fact that primates have hands and that we use them for, virtually almost everything we do in life. And we move objects, we exploit objects, and this kind of activity we primarily use our hands. Humans create technology with their hands and objects. We are very object-focused, and we do that with our hands. We show novel coordination of limbs and eye-hand coordination, which comes out of our primate heritage related to locomotion and feeding. Eye-hand coordination and feeding is one of the most ancient and shared general attributes of primates. And this gives primates a particular character in the kinds of embodied skills that we acquire that require extended practice. So these are primate typical characteristics. And along with our hands, of course, there are probably cognitive attributes of attention and memory and social attributes related to dynamics of attraction and competition. And there are human specificities in each of these domains, but the question is whether we can find shared attributes that provide weak biases that are somehow particular to primates. Okay. So I'm looking for biases that grow out of these and that are associated with a technological bent. So these are attributes that support expanded cultural performance in Heidel's terms, in the context of individual development and social historical setting. So I'm looking for these kinds of biases. So the one I want to talk about is working memory. Now, okay, I'm a psychologist. I work with individuals. I don't work at the population level for the most part. This has already been alluded to by Anand, who is somewhere here in the audience. Yeah. Working memory refers to the whole theoretical framework of structures and processes used for the temporary storage and manipulation of information, of which short-term memory is one component. So short-term memory is this sensory store of about 2 seconds, and I would argue that the chimpanzees who are doing the sequential number, spatial number recollection with the black and white computer display, we're using short-term memory, not working memory in its usual sense. So working memory is more or less what you're thinking about right now, and you forget if you're interrupted. And long-term memory is what you did last week or when you were a child. And sensory store is what's happening just within a very short 2-second period, more or less, of sounds, touch, feelings, vibrations, etc. Okay, so language is a strong supporter, a strong contributor to persistent working memory. We use language in rehearsal and for many other purposes in support of working memory. But other than language, what happens? And of course, if you're talking about primates in general, you have to talk about working memory outside of the language context. This is difficult to do for humans because we are linguistic creatures, but other primates are not. So these are all things that working memory allows you to do or supports. It's intimately related to motor processes, to activity, to action. It enables you to activate and sustain activity and representations, if you like that language. It supports planning and anticipation. It's integrated with or dependent upon attention. It's limited in span, perhaps to 3 to 4 chunks at a time. There's some debate about exactly what the limits are. It's limited in time due to its dependence on sustained attention. So that, of course, varies on the context and on the task. And we know that working memory for spatial matters is better than working memory for visual events, for example. But in humans, typically, and typically this is tested in adults, as far as I'm aware, it's usually somewhere on the order of 20 to 30 seconds, not 2 seconds and not many minutes, somewhere around a minute or a little less, or a little more if there's some support. So now, is there phylogenetic variation in working memory? No, we know there is individual variation within humans in working memory, and we know that variation in working memory is correlated with performance on a variety of cognitive tasks that altogether are supposed to say something about intelligence in one way or another. So we know there's variability in this, so but that's within one species. What about across species? Well, there's probably a lot of debate about this issue. I'm not widely read in working memory in non-human animals. It depends. There's many different experimental paradigms that the authors propose are testing working memory, and then there's debate whether that's actually working memory. For example, the radial arm maze with rats, where rats are put into this starburst kind of an apparatus with multiple arms, and they run down one arm and then they run down another arm and they find food rewards at the end. And in many cases, they're taken out and put back in several hours later or the next day. And sometimes that's cast as working memory. Some people say that is. Most people say it's long-term memory. So there's a lot of a debate within this field among the researchers themselves exactly what to classify as working memory. But in any case, if you're looking for phylogenetic variation in this across primates, we don't actually have a lot of evidence that there is deep variation across taxa within primates. We know that humans are probably better able to control attention and withstand interference, and that might be solely because of language, or perhaps it's also in addition to language. We are better at attentional control anyway. Humans deploy attention they deploy attention strategically and they rehearse. We don't know if other creatures do that. And we frequently use working memory in task-independent ways. We imagine things, and we, of course, have a difficult time knowing if other creatures do that. So let's think about social learning from the point of view of slight biases in working memory, slight tuning of the system with respect to working memory. It's really not easy to go from the experimental paradigms that are used to study working memory to talk about social biases and learning technical skills, but I'm going to try, not the experimental paradigms, but at least the ideas. So if we were thinking about looking at something related to working memory in a social learning situation, what would we look at? Well, the thing I came up with is temporal dynamics. And that could be looked at in terms of onset, which is not so much about working memory, but just how quickly it takes for social influence to ramp up activity or to influence activity. But more in persistence, in the decline of social influence once the activity that has been the, quote, demonstration has ended. How long does that other individual's activity influence the other individual, in this case, the observer? Whoops, sorry. So I'm going to talk about a case study. Now, I have really just a few drops of data relevant to the questions I want to talk about, unlike Susan and Brandon, who had buckets of data. But I want to share an idea with you, and then we'll see if the data are up to the task or not. They're mainly not up to the task, but I just want you to think about it. So my case study is about nut cracking in capuchin monkeys, and this is something that I've studied with my collaborators in the Ethocebus project for the last 11 or 12 years now. And this work takes place in the Cerrado, sort of seasonally dry habitat of Brazil with bearded capuchin monkeys. Their species name is Sapaju libidinosus. And they are approximately cat-sized monkeys with a semi-prehensile tail. They are highly adaptable. They're generalist quadrupedal primates. They're primarily arboreal, but they spend a lot of time on the ground as well. And they're close cousins to the monkeys that Susan and Brandon were talking about. So this, Susan has some nuts to hand out. It's a little bit of show and tell. These monkeys crack nuts using stone hammers. They crack at least nine different species of palm nuts, and they crack other seeds as well, not just palm nuts. And the nuts themselves range in size. Some are the size of a big plum, and some are sort of olive-sized. I mean, they range in size. They also range in shape from quite round to very irregular ellipsoid-shaped things. I'm wearing earrings made of these palm nuts. It's extremely hard, and I want you to think about an animal the size of your house cat cracking one of those things. It's an impressive feat, really, when you see it. Now let's see, I'm not sure if I have to click or I want this to play. Okay, here we go. This is just an overview of our field site, so you get an idea of the landscape. One of the most beautiful places in the world. Okay, so that gives you an idea what we see. We made a DVD about it if anybody's really interested to know more about the project and to see lots of other examples of interesting behavior of these monkeys. There's a DVD. So this is an example of a proficient adult, up a little closer than that long zoom-in shot that I just showed you. Whoops, wait. I have to click. Two, three. Okay, so this monkey weighs about 3.5 kilos, and he's hefting a stone there that weighs about 1.5 kilos. They routinely use stones that are even heavier than that. So this is what a little junior guy looks like. This monkey weighs about 1,300 grams, and he's working here with a stone that weighs 500 grams.
This small stone, about 500 grams.
He's illustrating all the things that can go wrong. You can miss the nut. So, and he went on like this for more than 20 minutes, and then the battery ran out on my camera, and he was still going. So they will practice this persistently. There was no way he was going to open that nut. Absolutely no way. If he'd been there for another 3 weeks cracking it like that, he was not going to open that nut. However, the monkeys, the young monkeys, practice striking like this, but even more, they handle the nuts and the anvil sites. They investigate the anvil sites, and they spend a lot of time working around and with the materials that are used in cracking nuts before they can crack nuts themselves. So one wonders, how are they learning to do this? So some of the things a young monkey must learn on the way to becoming a proficient cracker. They have to learn where to do it, what materials to use, what stones to use, what nuts to look for. They have to learn how to get the kernels out of the nutshell, which in the case of these multi-compartment nuts is not so straightforward. You can crack the nut and you might have one piece of one kernel exposed, but you have to keep cracking to get out the other kernels. They have to also learn to release the nut onto the anvil, and this is actually a very difficult thing for them to do because the thing they want is the nut, and they have to make this it has to be a problem solution distance of greater than 0. They have to put it down and release it. That's really hard for them to do. They have to strike the nut with a stone, which involves bipedal stance, and there's something to bipedal posture and dynamic balance. That's challenging. You saw the little guy practically fall off the anvil a couple of times when he was trying to do that. They have to manage the velocity and the angle of the strike, or the nut goes flying away and the stone flies off the anvil too. They have to manage the stone at the end of the strike so that it doesn't hit them or fall off the anvil. And so, this is an embodied skill. So out of this list, and I could go on with adding things to it, what actions might actually be affected by some other individual's activity? Where might we see social influence? So we've been trying to figure that out. And we've done a developmental study of nut cracking, and I'm going to just summarize it for you now. Because I want to get into the temporal dynamics, so I don't want to spend a lot of detail on this, but if you'd like, we can talk about it more later. So we were working with one habituated group of monkeys. We observed all the monkeys that were 3 months to 6 years of age, and in total that was 16 different individuals. We observed them for about 2 months a period, and we did that every 6 months for about 2.5 years. So from June 2011 to July 2013. So we had 5 observation periods. And this is what the sampling looks like, the density of sampling. It's kind of a staggered sample by age. So we had 2 people collecting data concurrently. One person followed one monkey for 20 minutes, continuously recording that monkey's location and activities. And this is a very standard field protocol in primatology. And the continuing activity was recorded at 3-second intervals, and we analyzed it as rates. So this is a kind of hybrid method, actually. It's not strictly continuous data when the activity was continuing. And the second person recorded the identity, location, and activity of all the other group members within different distance zones, from less than half a meter to up to 10 meters of the focal monkey, and we did that at 1 minute intervals. So that means at the buzzer, at 1 minute, the second person said, Joe is here at 3 meters doing this at this location, and he's eating nuts, and Mary is over here at 5 meters. Okay, and it takes a minute to record all that, and then we start over again. Okay, and then we merged the 2 data sets, so we have a chronological record, nearly continuous, of the focal animal with punctuated 1-minute notations of the neighbors and their activity. So we wound up with something over 2,000 focal observations. These are 20-minute periods. We averaged 38 of those per subject per period. And they were on average 19 minutes long, not 20, which was the ideal, so they're pretty darn close to 20 though. And this is the general picture. So these monkeys are weaned at approximately 18 months. That is completed weaning. They have an extended period of transition from nursing to feeding themselves on solid food. For the first year, the babies primarily remain in the trees. They don't come down to the ground so much. And they're certainly not trying to lift stones and strike things. They do directly percuss objects, but they're not really involved in the nut cracking scene. But once they are in their second year, they are definitely in this game. And they watch and they handle nuts a lot. And through 3 and 4 years, they're getting a little better at it. They're beginning to strike. They scrounge a lot in their second and third years in particular. By the time they're 5, they're beginning to be able to crack nuts, maybe 4, depending on how big they are. Females have their first infants sometime in their 6th year, that is between their 5th and 6th birthday. And males emigrate sometime, usually after they're 6, but you know, it varies a lot. They seem to emigrate in pairs. So if somebody is about 6 and they don't have a partner yet, they wait a little while, and then they go off maybe at 7 with somebody else that's 6, for example. This is a graph showing the growth in body mass of these monkeys over a 7-year period. And you can see that there's the blue line is male and the red line is females. Again, no political implications whatsoever for my color choices. But the point is that somewhere around 4 years of age, there's a considerable size difference between males and females. The females are still chugging along at somewhere between 1 and 1.5 kilos, and the males have already hit 1.5 kilos or even a little more by then. So the males from around age 3 or 4 have a size advantage compared to the females for what they can do hefting a stone. And they don't reach their adult body mass for years after that. So from these data, we would expect that proficiency in cracking is going to increase all the way up till they're around 8, 9, or 10 years old when they reach adult body mass. Our developmental data don't go that far. We stopped out at about 6 years. And this is how we collected these body mass data. The monkeys volunteered to go stand on a scale for us because we put water in a bowl at the end. So it's a very easy, convenient way for them to cooperate with us. And then we read their weight off a digital display. And you can see they're not the least bit afraid of us. They're extremely habituated. So now let me show you what social influence looks like for these young monkeys. Did it go? I clicked it. Let me do it again. So note the adult's total tolerance of this little kid in his face. Not just one, but 2. He's not sharing, but he's letting them hang around at very close range. So that's what we see. And here's another example. It's a little less social. That is, it's one observer for the most part. Wait, hang on a second. Did it go? This is an adult female cracking. So now she leaves and the little kid is still there, still handling the materials. I have 5 minutes? Okay, we'll keep going. All right, so the neighbors facilitate handling nuts. They facilitate striking a nut with a stone. The anvils facilitate practice. And the monkeys, the immature monkeys, are near an anvil most of the time when someone else is active there. So this whole system promotes practice. Scrounging is also relatively frequent. It happens mainly near an anvil when someone else is cracking, especially when the kids are little. So in sum, others' activity is a potent facilitator. But now I want to talk about the temporal dynamics. Okay, so in the human cognitive community, the human memory community, people look at forgetting curves, which are exponential curves of various forms. And Hoppet et al. Did this for wild meerkats observing a trained demonstrator, and they found a transient local enhancement effect of about 20 seconds, they reported. And observation of a conspecific interacting with an object was necessary and sufficient for that effect. So now I looked first at rapid onset and at the onset, and we expected a rapid onset, and we get that. It's within a minute. So when somebody starts to crack, you see practically the full-on social effect within the first minute. And that's true for striking a nut directly. We have too few cases of percussion of a nut with a stone to say much about that. But basically, the social influence rises very quickly. Talking about decline, it declines much more slowly. And the half-life for manipulation of nuts is something over 2 minutes. The temporal decline is specific to nuts. If you look at manipulating other things, it doesn't really change at all. If you look at the decline of time spent near an anvil, it also declines very slowly, and the half-life is about 2.8 minutes. Decline of striking, that is striking directly with direct percussion or striking a nut with a stone, didn't converge with an exponential model. And I want to point out that the range of variation in these behaviors, individual variation, is high. So we don't have enough of a database to say very much about it. So if you look at it, this is mean and standard deviation plotted here, and it's rate per 10 minute on the y-axis. You see a rapid decline, but it tails off after a while, but it doesn't converge to an exponential model. Okay, so to summarize that, others cracking had more or less a virtually immediate influence on youngsters handling nuts and presence near an anvil. The positive effects persist for minutes after the other's activity ends. It's back to baseline after about 7 minutes. And striking the nuts directly and striking nuts with a stone declined more variably, and I didn't finish the phrase here. And apparently more, I don't know what I was going to say there, but it's more variably. Okay, so back to weak cognitive biases that could lead to big impacts in cultural outcomes. Well, first of all, it suggests a half-life of more than 20 minutes after activity stops, suggests that working memory is sustained for minutes. That's probably aided by the physical setting. The artifacts are there, and they do this in familiar locations. And so remembering that someone was cracking, I imagine, is supported by sustained attention to the place where it took place and by the remnants of what they left behind, which includes the shells, but also the stone. And if we compare this, the only other comparative data I have to compare it with is Hoppet et al.'s data with meerkats, which was on the order of 20 seconds. So is that a primate signature? Okay, that's a very big claim. But we could do with some more comparative data on this measure, I would say. So some hypotheses linking working memory with social biases in primates. And here I'm really just starting. So I imagine people will have improvements to suggest to this. So one could propose primates have a bias to stronger sustained attention or working memory for object manipulation than for other kinds of activities. That spatially localized activities are more susceptible to social influence via their support for sustained attention. That the temporal duration of others' activity affects susceptibility to social influence, which again is through support for sustained attention. And that these biases will be somehow greater in primates than in other orders that do not rely on eye-hand coordination in feeding to the same extent that primates do. So I'm trying to begin to formulate a primate signature in social learning. I have no idea if I'm on the right track. It's a first step. So what I hope we can get at some point is temporal dynamics for other species in some sort of species-typical task and setting, which is one of the virtues of what we do. It has a lot of problems working in a field setting, but it is an ecologically valid thing that we are looking at. I wish we could evaluate the hypothesis that primates have a stronger bias in these tests than other orders. I have no idea if that's true, and so forth for these other ideas. We don't, as far as I know, have data that bear on these hypotheses. I'm not sure. Have to root more around. Maybe you can suggest that we do have data that's relevant that I don't know about. And I'm through. Thank you very much.